Daniel Cross, the ruthless yet brilliant CEO of Horizon Air, boards his own flight undercover, expecting to find minor service flaws. Instead, he freezes mid-sip of his coffee. Just 2 rows behind him, 2 passengers are whispering about taking him down. They aren't just angry customers, they have a plan against him and his entire company. As Daniel listens, his heartbeat pounds. Is this corporate sabotage, a personal vendetta? He doesn't know yet, but one thing is clear: he's running out of time. What starts as a quiet flight will spiral into a public confrontation, a sabotage attempt, and a final showdown that will change everything. Before we dive in, buckle up, get ready, and subscribe. There's a special surprise coming tomorrow. Daniel Cross adjusted the cuff of his blazer and settled into the plush first-class seat, suppressing a sigh. He never enjoyed these undercover assessments, but they were necessary. Too many CEOs sat behind polished desks, reading sugar-coated reports while their companies rotted from within. Horizon Air had grown too fast, too big. He needed to know what his passengers truly experienced, not what his board wanted him to hear. He glanced around, observing the flight attendants as they moved through the cabin. The service was smooth, efficient, but distant. Smiles felt rehearsed. A businessman 2 rows ahead had been waiting for a drink refill for 10 minutes. Small cracks, not disasters, but enough to hint at deeper problems. Daniel shifted slightly. In his seat, letting his gaze wander, a woman in the window seat across from him adjusted her jacket, her eyes scanning the cabin like she was waiting for something. Next to her, a man leaned in, speaking in a low voice. Daniel hadn't paid them much attention before, but something about their hushed conversation prickled at his instincts. He wasn't the only one watching the airline tonight. Then he heard, Horizon Air is going to regret this," the man muttered. Daniel kept his face neutral, tilting his head just slightly as if lost in thought. "They don't even know what's coming," the woman replied. His fingers tightened slightly around the armrest. He had spent years turning Horizon into an industry leader. The pandemic nearly wiped them out. Layoffs were brutal, cost-cutting unavoidable, but it had saved the company. Now they were profitable again, expanding, growing, and yet here were 2 passengers speaking as if they were preparing to burn it all down. "Cross thinks he can get away with it forever," the man continued. "This time, we make sure he pays." Daniel's heart pounded once, twice, then years of discipline took over. He reached for his water, keeping his movements deliberate. He couldn't afford to react. Not yet. The woman exhaled sharply. "I just want them to listen. If he won't, we'll force them to." The man scoffed. "That's not enough. They don't care unless they hurt. The demonstration is just the start. Demonstration." Daniel's mind worked fast. A protest, a lawsuit, or something more dangerous. He casually shifted his gaze toward the man's reflection in the darkened cabin window. He looked mid-40s, with worn hands, the kind of calluses that came from real work. A mechanic? A former employee? His clothes were plain, but his anger wasn't. It was deep, personal. Daniel's pulse steadied. He had built an empire on anticipating threats before they surfaced. If this was one, he needed to know everything. For now, he would wait, listen, gather every piece of information, and when the time came, he would strike first. Daniel kept his breathing steady, his expression unreadable. The plane hummed beneath him, the quiet conversations of other passengers blending into white noise, but his focus remained razor-sharp on the 2 voices behind him. He tilted his head just slightly, careful not to draw attention, letting their words filter through the low hum of the cabin. "We have to be careful," the woman, Sophia, he assumed, whispered. "We can't afford another mistake." The man, Elijah, exhaled sharply. "There won't be. Everything's in place. We do this right. It doesn't just rattle them, it forces a reckoning." Reckoning. The word had weight. Daniel's grip tightened around his water bottle, his mind running through possibilities. Was this about money? A disgruntled former employee seeking revenge? A union pushback? He'd dealt with all of it before. Angry investors, pilots threatening strikes, lawsuits from employees who thought they were owed more than what the contracts allowed. But this felt different. They weren't just talking about a demonstration. They were talking about action. He needed more. He set his drink down and stretched slightly, shifting his position in his seat so he could steal a glance at them in the reflection of his screen. Elijah's face was lined with frustration, but his eyes burned with purpose. His hands were clasped together, his knuckles white. He wasn't just angry, he was determined. A man, early 30s, her dark eyes flickering with something more hesitant. She was angry too, but there was restraint in the way she spoke, a hesitance in her body language. She wasn't fully convinced, or maybe she was afraid. Daniel could work with fear. "You really think this will get through to him?" Sophia asked. "Cross doesn't listen. He doesn't care. He never has." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to stay still. Elijah's voice hardened. "Then we make him care." Sophia hesitated, rubbing her hands together. "What about the others?" "They're in," Elijah said. "They know what this means. If Horizon wants to pretend like nothing happened, like they can keep cutting corners, keep taking from people who gave their lives to that company." He stopped, inhaling sharply. "We make sure no one ignores us this time." Sophia's shoulders slumped slightly, but she nodded. "Fine, but no one gets hurt." Elijah didn't answer right away. Daniel turned his gaze back to his screen, his pulse steady. He had heard enough. This wasn't a random pair of passengers venting about delayed flights or baggage fees. This was something calculated, personal, and it involved more than just these two. He needed to know how deep this ran. As the plane began its descent, Daniel made a silent decision. The second they landed, he would take action. Not publicly, not yet. He had built an empire by staying ahead of threats before they became disasters, and this had all the makings of a disaster. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Daniel remained still, his mind calculating his next move. He had enough experience to know that direct confrontation wasn't the answer, not yet. He needed more information. Who were Elijah and Sophia working with? What exactly was their plan? He needed to understand the game before making his first move. When the seatbelt sign flickered off, passengers around him immediately stood, stretching and grabbing their bags. He stayed seated, watching through the reflection of the overhead compartments as Elijah and Sophia gathered their things. They moved with purpose, not the sluggish shuffle of exhausted travelers. They weren't lingering, they were focused. Daniel reached for his phone, keeping it low in his lap as he typed a quick message to his security team. 2 subjects, row 14, seats B and C. Track them, but don't engage. The reply came within seconds. Understood. Daniel stood, adjusting his posture into something casual. He moved with the flow of the passengers, stepping into the aisle as if he had no particular urgency, but every second counted. By the time he reached the terminal, his phone buzzed again. Subjects heading toward exit gate C, no checked luggage. Walking fast. They were traveling light. That meant they had a reason to get in and get out quickly. This wasn't a leisure trip. They had come here for a purpose. Daniel adjusted his carry-on strap and walked in the opposite direction toward the airport's private executive exit. If Elijah and Sophia had ties to his company, he needed to confirm them. He had spent years perfecting his network of information, and he wasn't about to let 2 rogue passengers get ahead of him. Inside a quiet lounge, he dialed a number. The voice on the other end answered on the first ring. "I need 2 names run through the database," Daniel said, keeping his voice calm, controlled. "Elijah, last name unknown, mid-40s, possibly ex-employee. Sophia, early 30s, likely connected." A brief pause. Then, "Give me 5 minutes." Daniel ended the call and sat, exhaling slowly. He tapped his fingers against his knee, mind already running through possibilities. If Elijah had worked for Horizon, there would be a record. If Sophia had a connection, he'd find it. His phone buzzed again. "Elijah Carter," the voice said. "Former maintenance crew, Horizon Air. Worked 10 years before being laid off in the cost cuts 2 years ago. Filed multiple complaints before. Termination, no criminal record, but he's been involved in multiple labor protests since." Daniel's stomach tightened. That explained the anger. Losing a job, losing stability, that could turn even the most loyal employee into an enemy. And "Sophia!" A longer pause. Then, Sofia Rivera, daughter of Luis Rivera. Daniel's breath hitched. He knew that name. Luis Rivera had been a Horizon mechanic. He had also died in a maintenance accident 4 years ago. Now it all made sense. This wasn't just revenge. This was personal. Daniel closed his eyes for a brief second, but the past clawed its way back, sharp and unrelenting. Luis Rivera, a name buried under reports, legal statements, and sleepless nights. A Horizon mechanic who had died in an accident the company had deemed a tragedy caused by individual error. His family had fought back, claimed that Horizon cut corners on safety regulations, that Luis had been forced to work in unsafe conditions, but the board had silenced the noise with settlements and PR final approval himself, then moved forward like he always did. And now, 4 years later, Luis Rivera's daughter was sitting 2 rows behind him, whispering about making Horizon Air pay. Daniel exhaled through his nose, gripping his phone tighter. This wasn't some random protest. This was a ticking bomb. His security team had already confirmed that Elijah and Sofia had left the airport and taken a rideshare downtown. That meant he had time to dig deeper. Before making a move, he switched screens and pulled up Horizon's internal employee records. Elijah Carter's file was still there, albeit flagged as inactive. Termination reason, workforce reduction, complaint history, filed 4 safety reports against the maintenance department citing hazardous conditions. All reports marked investigated, no action required. Daniel felt something dark settle in his stomach. He had seen thousands of these complaints over the years. He had brushed off most of them, trusting that the right people had handled them. But now, looking at it with fresh eyes, knowing that Elijah had been raising red flags before Luis Rivera's accident, had he been ignored? Worse, had he been silenced? Daniel scrolled further. His employment ended just 6 months after Luis's death. A layoff. On paper. A convenient dismissal in reality. His phone buzzed again. Subjects at Ironwood Cafe, private table near back, speaking to 2 others. Daniel didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat and left the lounge, heading toward the airport's private exit, where his car was waiting. He needed to see them himself, needed to understand what kind of storm was about to hit. The ride to Ironwood Cafe was quick, the city lights blurring past as he stared out the window, thoughts spiraling. If Elijah and Sofia were gathering allies, this wasn't just a protest. This was a movement, a well-planned one. His driver pulled up a block away, giving him space to approach unnoticed. He stepped out, adjusting his jacket, and scanned the cafe through the glass. There they were, Elijah speaking with conviction. Sofia, arms crossed, tension in her shoulders. Across from them, 2 men nodded along. One of them Daniel recognized, Jared Mills, another ex-Horizon employee. The circle was growing. Daniel took a steady breath. He wasn't walking into a trap. Not yet, but he was walking into something much bigger than he had anticipated. Daniel didn't go inside. Not yet. Instead, he positioned himself outside the cafe, standing just far enough to avoid being noticed, but close enough to study them. Elijah was doing most of the talking, his hands moving with purpose, his voice rising and falling in intensity. Sofia, arms still crossed, nodded along but rarely spoke. Jared Mills leaned forward, nodding, his jaw tight. The 4th man, someone Daniel didn't recognize, scribbled something in a notebook. This wasn't some thrown-together rant session. They were planning, strategizing. Daniel took out his phone and snapped a quick photo, sending it to his security. "Team, identify the 4th man. Get me everything on him." He exhaled slowly, then turned away. He had seen enough. If he stayed any longer, he risked being spotted. And right now, the last thing he needed was to tip them off. He had to stay ahead. By the time he returned to his car, his mind was already racing through options. He could call his PR team, have them dig up something to discredit Elijah and Sofia. That would be the simplest move. Control the narrative before they had a chance to. But something in his gut told him that wouldn't work. Not this time. This wasn't just a couple of disgruntled ex-employees making noise. This was personal, and personal was dangerous. His phone buzzed as his driver pulled away from the curb. Fourth man identified, Marcus Lively. Labor rights organizer, has been involved in several successful corporate takedowns, helped lead the protests against Orion Freight Airlines before they collapsed. Daniel cursed under his breath. That settled it. This wasn't just an ex-employee grudge. This was a full-scale attack on Horizon Air, and if Lively was involved, it meant media attention, legal battles, and a potential shareholder nightmare. The car wove through the city streets as Daniel formulated his next move. He needed to act before they did. He couldn't let them dictate the story. If they were planning a public demonstration, he had to get ahead of it. By the time he arrived back at Horizon Air's corporate headquarters, his decision was made. He strode through the glass doors and into the executive wing, where his assistant looked up from her desk, startled by his unexpected arrival. "Get me PR," he ordered. "Legal, too. I want a full breakdown of all employee complaints in the last 5 years. Find out if anyone else has been sniffing around Horizon. Journalists, investigators, anyone." His assistant nodded, already typing. Daniel walked into his office and their people wanted a fight. They were about to get one. But he wasn't going to play defense. He was going to take control, and he was going to make sure that whatever they had planned, it never even got off the ground. Daniel sat at the head of the conference table, his fingers steepled, eyes cold, as his senior team rushed in. PR, legal, security. Every department he needed was here. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. Elijah Carter and Sofia Rivera. He began, his voice measured but firm. "They're organizing against us. They've brought in Marcus Lively, the same man who helped take down Orion Freight Airlines. This isn't just a protest. It's a coordinated attack." A murmur ran through the room, but Daniel ignored it. He turned to his head of PR, a sharp-eyed woman named Claire. "I need every employee complaint from the last 5 years, especially those related to safety or layoffs. Find any pattern. If there's something they can use against us, I want to know about it before they do." Claire nodded, flipping through her tablet, already pulling records. "But if this goes public, we're going to need a counter-message. Something strong." Daniel's gaze darkened. "We don't just need a counter-message. We need to dismantle their credibility before they gain momentum." The head of legal, a man named Wexler, cleared his throat. "We could push a preemptive legal motion. If we can prove defamation or unlawful interference, we might be able to shut them down before they go public." Daniel shook his head. "Too aggressive. It'll make us look guilty." He tapped the table. "We need something cleaner, a way to turn public opinion against them before they get their message out." One of the junior PR reps hesitated before speaking. "What if we make it about safety, emphasize how we prioritize passenger well-being, how layoffs were a necessary evil to keep the airline alive? If we frame them as reckless, willing to disrupt travel, it might undercut their movement." Daniel considered it. It wasn't a bad angle. People cared about safety. If they believed Elijah and Sophia were putting passengers at risk, it could shift the narrative in Horizon's favor. "Prepare 2 statements," he ordered. "One for internal employees, reinforcing our commitment to them. The second, a broader, public-facing campaign about our safety and reliability record." Claire scribbled notes. "And if they respond?" Daniel leaned back, his jaw tightening. "They will, and that's when we escalate." A knock at the door interrupted the meeting. His assistant peeked inside, her face tense. "Sir, you need to see this." She placed a tablet in front of him, the screen opened to a live news feed. Daniel's stomach turned cold. On the screen, outside Horizon Air headquarters, stood Elijah Carter and Sofia Rivera, backed by over 100 protesters and a wall of reporters. The demonstration had already begun. Microphones were shoved toward Elijah as he spoke, his voice firm. Horizon Air took from its workers. It ignored safety concerns. It cut corners while executives got richer. And now, we're here to demand accountability. The crowd roared. Daniel exhaled slowly. They weren't just fighting back. They were winning. Daniel stood in front of the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, watching the scene unfold below. The protest had grown. What had started as a handful of voices was now a full-blown demonstration. Hundreds of people standing outside Horizon Air's headquarters, holding signs, chanting slogans, demanding justice. The media had latched onto the story, their cameras, capturing every moment. Elijah Carter stood at the forefront, gripping a microphone, his voice raw with passion. Horizon Air abandoned the people who built this company. They slashed jobs, ignored safety concerns, and let workers suffer while executives cashed in. He turned to the cameras, his expression steeled. Today we say enough. The crowd erupted in cheers. Daniel's fingers curled into fists. He had underestimated them. He had assumed this would be a slow burn, a fight he could control from the shadows. But Elijah and Sophia had gone straight for the jugular, making this public. And the worst part, the media wanted this story. A corporate giant under fire, former employees exposing corruption. It was the perfect narrative. His phone buzzed on his desk. Claire's voice came through the speaker. "We have a problem." "No kidding." She exhaled sharply. "It's bigger than just bad press. Our sources in the media say Elijah and Sophia have something. Documents, evidence, something that could prove safety violations." Daniel's blood ran cold. "What kind of evidence?" "Not sure yet," Claire admitted. "But if it's real, it could be a disaster. We need to respond now." His mind racing. If they had proof, real proof, then this wasn't just a PR battle. This could turn into lawsuits, government investigations, even a collapse in stock prices. He had seen it happen to other companies. If he wasn't careful, Horizon could be next. He grabbed his phone and dialed security. "Get me a full report on our maintenance records. Find any leaks. If anyone inside has been feeding them information, I want names." As he spoke, another notification flashed across his screen. A newscaster stood outside the protest, her expression serious. "Breaking news. Horizon Air CEO Daniel Cross has yet to make a statement regarding the allegations. Protesters claim that critical safety concerns were ignored, leading to preventable accidents." Daniel inhaled through his nose, forcing himself to stay calm. He had built this company. He had saved it from collapse when others had doubted him. He wasn't about to let two disgruntled ex-employees destroy everything. He turned to Claire. "Prepare a response. We go on the offensive, paint them as extremists, make it clear that Horizon prioritizes safety and stability. We don't engage with baseless accusations." Claire hesitated. "And if they have proof," Daniel's jaw tightened, "then we make sure the world never sees it." The phone rang again. This time it wasn't PR. It was security, and from the sharp tone of the voice on the other end, something had just gone terribly wrong. Daniel answered the call immediately, his grip tightening around the phone. "Talk to me." The voice on the other end was tense. "Sir, there's been a security breach at the maintenance hangar. We have a situation." A cold knot formed in Daniel's stomach. "Define situation." "Someone tampered with an aircraft, scheduled for departure tomorrow morning. One of the engineers caught it during a routine check. If the plane had taken off..." The man hesitated. "It would have been catastrophic." Daniel's mind sharpened. This wasn't just a protest. This was an act of sabotage. "Who did it?" "We have security footage," the guard continued. "Two figures near the aircraft, wearing maintenance uniforms. The footage is grainy, but we're enhancing it now." Daniel paced to his desk, fingers tapping against the polished surface. "Do we have any suspects?" The silence on the other end lasted just a beat too long. Elijah and Sophia were seen near the hangar earlier tonight. Daniel's jaw locked. That was all he needed to hear. He had played this cautiously, giving them space, trying to control the narrative through PR and media strategies. But if they had crossed the line into sabotage, all bets were off. "Call the police," he ordered. "Send them everything we have, and put out a public statement. Make sure the world knows exactly what they've done." "Yes, sir." Daniel ended the call and exhaled slowly. He had given them the benefit of the doubt, had even considered that maybe, just maybe, they had a legitimate grievance. But this was a direct attack, not just on the company, but on people's lives. His phone buzzed again. "Claire." "Daniel, wait," she said the second he picked up. I just spoke with someone in our compliance team. They're reviewing the security logs from the hangar. Something isn't adding up. Daniel frowned. What do you mean? The time stamps. Claire's voice was cautious. The logs show Elijah and Sophia entering the area, but there's a gap in the footage before the actual sabotage happened. Almost like, she hesitated, like the video was altered. Daniel's pulse ticked upward. You think they're being framed? I think it's possible. Claire lowered her voice. Look, I'm not saying they're innocent. But if we go public with this, and it turns out they weren't responsible, it'll blow up in our faces. We need to be absolutely sure before we move. Daniel exhaled sharply. Every instinct in him wanted to crush this problem immediately, to go after Elijah and Sophia with everything he had. But Claire was right. If this was a setup, if someone inside his own company had orchestrated this, he had a much bigger problem than 2 ex-employees. Find out who had access to the footage, he said finally. I want answers, now. And for the first time since this had all started, a different kind of unease crept into his gut. Because if someone inside Horizon Air was behind this, then he wasn't just fighting a protest, he was fighting a traitor. Daniel stared at the city skyline through his office window, the distant hum of protests still audible from the streets below. His mind was spinning. If Elijah and Sophia had been framed, it meant someone inside Horizon Air wanted them taken out of the equation. Badly. And that raised the most dangerous question of all. Why? His phone vibrated on the desk. Claire again. I have something, she said the moment he answered. The security logs were altered from inside the system. Only a handful of people have that level of access, she continued. The breach came from an admin account tied to one of your senior executives. Daniel's stomach clenched. Who? He repeated, voice sharper, a beat of silence. Then, Richard Holloway. Daniel's grip on the phone tightened. Holloway was the chief operations officer, one of the highest-ranking executives in the company. A man Daniel had trusted for years. Claire kept going. I also found something else, a series of encrypted emails between Holloway and a private consulting firm. They're talking about expansion opportunities and potential regulatory bypass strategies. And here's the kicker. The timeline overlaps with the layoffs and the ignored safety complaints. Daniel exhaled, pressing his fingers against his temple. It was all clicking into place. Holloway had been running his own agenda. The layoffs, the cost-cutting, the ignored reports. It hadn't just been about keeping the company afloat. It had been about maximizing profit at any cost. And now, with Elijah and Sophia pushing back, Holloway had gone one step further. Sabotage, framing them, making them the villains. Why? Daniel muttered. What's his endgame? Claire hesitated. I don't know yet, but I think it's bigger than just protecting his reputation. There's money involved, a lot of it. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. Horizon Air was his company. He had built it, saved it, sacrificed for it. And now, one of his own executives was playing games with people's lives. He turned back, toward the window, staring down at the protesters. Elijah and Sophia had been telling the truth, at least in part. There really had been corruption inside Horizon. They had been fighting against something real, and Daniel, blinded by his own instinct to protect the company, had nearly crushed them for it. The irony made his stomach turn. He straightened. There was no time for guilt. He needed to act before Holloway covered his tracks. Where is he now? Daniel asked. Claire exhaled. At the off-site executive lounge, meeting with legal. He doesn't know we're onto him yet. Daniel nodded. Good. Keep it that way. Ending the call, he grabbed his jacket and headed for the elevator. Holloway thought he had played the perfect game, moving pieces in the shadows. But Daniel Cross wasn't just any CEO. He had built this company by being ruthless. And now it was time to remind Holloway exactly who he was dealing with. Daniel strode through the executive lounge with purpose, his presence alone, enough to send a ripple of unease through the room. Conversations halted. Lawyers and high-ranking staff exchanged wary glances. They knew something was coming. At the far end of the lounge, Richard Holloway sat comfortably in a leather chair, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He barely looked up. As Daniel approached, "Daniel," Holloway greeted smoothly. "Didn't expect to see you here. Thought you'd be holed up in PR meetings trying to put out fires." Daniel didn't sit. He simply loomed over him, his voice sharp. "Cut the act, Richard. I know what you did." Holloway raised an eyebrow, swirling his drink lazily. "You'll have to be more specific." Daniel leaned in, lowering his voice to a dangerous whisper. "You framed them. You orchestrated the sabotage at the hangar, then doctored the security footage to pin it on Elijah and Sophia." For a fraction of a second, Holloway's fingers tightened around his glass. A tell. Then he chuckled. "Daniel, that's a serious accusation. I hope you have proof." Daniel threw a folder onto the table. Holloway's smirk flickered as he opened it, scanning the documents inside. Email records, financial transfers, security logs. It was airtight. "Here's what's going to happen," Daniel said, his voice ice cold. "You're going to resign, effective immediately. You're going to issue a statement admitting your actions, and you're going to disappear. If you don't, I will personally ensure that you're not just removed from this company. You'll be in a courtroom explaining why you tampered with an aircraft." Holloway's jaw clenched, the weight of the situation sinking in. "And if I refuse?" Daniel gave a humorless smile. "Then I bring in the authorities, and you spend the next decade explaining yourself to federal investigators." Silence stretched between them. Holloway exhaled sharply and set his glass down. "You think this ends with me?" he muttered. "You think Horizon Air stays clean after I walk away? You and I both know this company was built on cutting corners." Daniel's eyes darkened. "Maybe. But that changes now." Holloway gave a bitter laugh, but said nothing more. He knew he had lost. Slowly, he stood, adjusting his tie. "I'll have my resignation on your desk within the hour." Daniel didn't move as Holloway walked past him, but the tension in his shoulders didn't ease. He had handled one problem, but outside, hundreds of protesters still stood, demanding justice. He had spent the last week. He realized he needed to do something else. He needed to face them. Daniel straightened his tie and turned toward the exit. It was time for the truth, and this time, it wouldn't be a PR spin. It would be the reckoning Horizon Air deserved. Daniel stepped out of the Horizon Air headquarters and into chaos. The protest had swelled even larger, a sea of faces packed tightly against barricades. Camera crews jostled for position, microphones extended toward the front lines. Chants filled the air, raw and relentless. At the center of it all stood Elijah. Carter and Sophia Rivera. Elijah spotted him first, his posture stiffening, his eyes sharp with anger and suspicion. Sophia turned a beat later, her expression unreadable. The crowd noticed too. A ripple of tension spread as people pointed. Cameras swung in his direction, and the noise exploded. "Daniel Cross, face the truth. Horizon Air is built on lies." He had spent his entire career controlling the narrative, spinning crises into opportunities, turning public perception in his favor. But this time, there was no script, no PR-crafted response, just the cold, undeniable truth. He raised his hands for silence. It didn't come immediately, but the sight of him standing there, unprotected, alone, was enough to make some hesitate. The chants softened. Then Elijah stepped forward, microphone in hand. His voice was razor-sharp. "You think walking out here changes anything?" "I'm not here to change your minds," Daniel said. His voice was firm, carrying across the tense crowd. "I'm here because I finally listened." A murmur swept through the protesters. Sophia narrowed her eyes, skeptical. Elijah crossed his arms, waiting. Daniel took a slow breath. Now or never. 4 years ago, Luis Rivera died because Horizon Air ignored safety concerns. That is a fact, he said, his voice steady. We failed him, we failed his family, and we failed all of you. The weight of his words sent a shockwave through the crowd. No corporate executive ever admitted guilt, ever. The air itself seemed to tighten. Sophia's eyes widened, her fingers gripping the microphone. Elijah took a half step forward, stunned. Daniel didn't stop. "I spent this past week trying to bury this, to silence all of you, because I believed that protecting the company meant crushing the opposition." He shook his head. "I was wrong." Whispers ran through the protesters. A few exchanged glances. Elijah Carter and Sofia Rivera weren't trying to destroy this company, Daniel continued. They were trying to save it, and I nearly let the real threat go unchecked. Elijah's jaw clenched. Sofia's lips parted slightly, her expression shifting from anger to something more complicated. Daniel exhaled. Richard Holloway, the man who orchestrated the layoffs, ignored the safety complaints, and tried to frame your movement for sabotage, has been removed. Effective immediately. Gasps. More murmurs. Confusion. For too long, Horizon Air has protected the wrong people, Daniel said. That ends today. The crowd was silent now. Then Sofia stepped forward, slowly, cautiously. Then prove it, she said. And for the first time in his life, Daniel Cross knew he would. Daniel stood firm as the weight of Sofia's words settled. Over the crowd. Then prove it. There was no escaping now, no corporate buffer between him and the people demanding change. The old Daniel Cross, the one who operated behind closed doors, controlling narratives from the safety of his office, would have found a way to spin this, to make empty promises, to ride out the storm until the media lost interest. But that man had already lost. The truth was, the company he had built was broken, and fixing it meant doing something he had never done before. He nodded. I will. The crowd remained silent, waiting. Watching. Sofia's stare was unwavering, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Elijah still looked unconvinced, but there was something in his posture, a hesitation, a sliver of consideration. Daniel turned to face them directly. Horizon Air is implementing a full third-party investigation into our safety practices and employment policies. Effective immediately, an independent oversight board, not owned by me, not owned by my executives, will review every complaint that's been ignored, every violation that's been covered up. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Real action, not just words. Sofia tilted her head slightly. And who's going to be on this board? Daniel didn't flinch. You! A stunned silence. Sofia blinked, her lips parting slightly. Elijah tensed, his fists clenching. The crowd was motionless, their anticipation crackling like a live wire. Daniel kept going. Not just you. Workers, mechanics, pilots, people who know this company better than the executives ever could. He took a deep breath. I've been running this airline without listening to the people who actually keep it in the air. Genuinely thrown. That ends now. She glanced at Elijah, who was staring at Daniel like he had grown a second head. You want us to oversee you? Elijah asked, his voice skeptical, edged with disbelief. Daniel nodded. Yes. Elijah studied him for a long moment. Then, with a deep breath, he extended a hand. The crowd gasped. Sofia's eyes darted between them. She wasn't ready to trust, not yet, but she saw the shift happening, the impossible moment unfolding. Daniel reached out and clasped Elijah's hand. The tension broke. A mix of shock, relief, and cautious optimism spread through the protesters. Someone started clapping, then another and another. It wasn't overwhelming, not yet, but it was something. Sofia exhaled sharply, rubbing her temples. If you think this makes everything okay, it doesn't, she said. I know, Daniel admitted, but it's a start. For the first time in days, he wasn't fighting the inevitable. He was stepping into it. And as the first hints of dawn broke over the city skyline, Daniel Cross finally understood. Horizon Air wasn't his empire to control anymore. It was something bigger, something worth saving.